The room always reveals the man who is too nice. You see him before he speaks. He is the one trying to make everyone comfortable, the one softening his words, the one nodding even when he disagrees. He believes kindness will protect him, that patience will earn respect, that goodwill will somehow rise like cream to the top of human affairs. But the world rarely rewards the man who refuses to understand its darker mechanics. Niccolò Machiavelli watched men like this for years in the courts of Florence. He watched honest diplomats lose negotiations to liars, honorable officials lose influence to manipulators, and principled leaders lose power to men who felt no discomfort bending the truth. The pattern repeated itself so many times that Machiavelli began asking a disturbing question. What if goodness alone is not a strategy? What if being decent is admirable, but strategically incomplete? Nice men often believe that integrity will eventually win the day. They assume that if they behave fairly, speak honestly, and treat others well, people will eventually recognize their virtue. They imagine that the world is secretly governed by moral accounting, where good behavior accumulates invisible credit that will someday be rewarded. But the real world operates on perception, leverage, and advantage, not on invisible moral bookkeeping. Machiavelli understood something that many nice men refuse to admit. Power does not go to the most virtuous person in the room. It goes to the person who understands the rules of influence better than everyone else. And those rules are not always comfortable to accept. They include the management of fear, the shaping of appearances, the careful use of charm, and occasionally the strategic deployment of ruthlessness. This does not mean Machiavelli believed men should become monsters. That misunderstanding has haunted his name for centuries. What he actually suggested in his famous work, The Prince, was far more subtle and far more unsettling. Good men must learn how the ruthless operate, because refusing to understand their methods only guarantees defeat. A man who insists on fighting wolves while pretending they are sheep is not noble. He is naive. Consider the nice man at work. He volunteers for extra tasks because he wants to be helpful. He avoids conflict because he values harmony. He speaks honestly about his intentions because deception feels uncomfortable. Meanwhile, another colleague quietly studies the hierarchy of the office like a chessboard. That colleague knows exactly who influences promotions, who controls budgets, and who can quietly block someone's advancement. One man is behaving ethically, while the other is behaving strategically. And in most organizations, strategy beats sincerity. The nice man leaves the office confused after being overlooked again. He tells himself that politics must have been involved, as if politics were an unfortunate accident rather than the central engine of human institutions. He reassures himself that integrity matters more than advancement, yet secretly wonders why his integrity seems to benefit everyone except himself. What he fails to see is that kindness without awareness becomes a resource others learn to exploit. Machiavelli would say the problem is not kindness, the problem is blindness. A man who refuses to study manipulation does not eliminate manipulation from his life. He simply guarantees that he will be its victim. The world is filled with people who understand leverage, persuasion, and strategic pressure extremely well. If you refuse to learn those tools, you do not create a fair world. You create a situation where unfair people dominate. Nice men often misunderstand power because they associate it with cruelty. They imagine that power requires abandoning decency entirely, turning oneself into a tyrant who bulldozes everyone else. But Machiavelli's insight was far more refined. The effective man does not live in cruelty. He simply keeps cruelty available as an option. The difference between weakness and strength is often the difference between being unable to do something and choosing not to do it. A man who cannot intimidate is harmless. A man who can intimidate but chooses diplomacy is powerful. This distinction is everything. When people sense that a man has no edge, no boundary, no capacity for retaliation, they unconsciously begin testing him. Requests become demands, Disagreements become dismissals. His kindness slowly transforms into permission for others to ignore him. The tragedy is that the nice man rarely notices the shift until it is too late. Machiavelli observed that effective leaders understood how to control both admiration and fear. They did not rely exclusively on one emotion, because relying on only one emotion creates vulnerability. A ruler loved but not feared becomes easy to manipulate. A ruler feared but not respected becomes easy to overthrow. The art of power lies in managing both forces simultaneously. For the modern man, this lesson applies everywhere. It applies in business negotiations, in leadership roles, in friendships, and even in romantic relationships. When a man refuses to demonstrate strength, others instinctively place him in the category of people who can be ignored without consequence. The world reads signals constantly, and one of the clearest signals a man can send is that he will tolerate almost anything in the name of being nice. And that signal is interpreted as weakness. The Machiavellian advice for nice men is therefore brutally simple. Continue being decent if that reflects your values, but never become dependent on decency alone. Develop the ability to enforce boundaries, to shape perception, to withdraw cooperation, and to apply pressure when necessary. A man who understands these tools rarely needs to use them often, but their mere presence changes how others treat him. In many ways, Machiavelli believed that the most dangerous men were not the cruel ones, but the naive ones. Cruel men at least understand the rules of the game. Naive men walk into the game believing it is something else entirely. They expect fairness where there is competition, honesty where there is strategy, and gratitude where there is calculation. History shows how these expectations usually end. The nice prince loses his throne. The honest minister loses influence. The generous businessman loses his company to someone who studied contracts more carefully than he studied virtue. The pattern repeats across centuries because human nature has not changed as much as we would like to believe. The first step in Machiavellian wisdom is simply seeing the world clearly, not as we wish it were, but as it actually operates. And once a man sees clearly, his behavior begins to change. He stops explaining himself to people who benefit from misunderstanding him. He stops offering unlimited access to his time and energy. He stops assuming that everyone else is guided by the same moral framework that guides him. Most importantly, he stops believing that kindness alone is a sufficient defense against manipulation. This is not the death of goodness. It is the beginning of intelligence. Nice men often fear that adopting Machiavellian awareness will corrupt them. They imagine that the moment they learn how power works, they will lose their humanity. But the opposite is usually true. When a man understands manipulation, he becomes harder to manipulate. When he understands intimidation, he becomes harder to intimidate. Knowledge does not create evil, it creates immunity. Machiavelli never asked good men to abandon their values. He asked them to stop pretending that everyone else shares those values. The man who understands this difference steps into the world with open eyes. He recognizes charm when it is sincere and when it is strategic. He recognizes threats when they are subtle and when they are obvious. Nice men, by contrast, often treat social situations like moral tests. They believe that if they simply act with honesty and fairness, the system will reward them for their virtue. They expect their work to speak for itself, their loyalty to be noticed, and their generosity to be remembered. But Machiavelli observed something far less comforting about human nature. People rarely reward goodness simply because it exists. They reward the individuals who make their value impossible to ignore. This is where the Machiavellian lesson begins to sharpen. A man must understand that influence is not granted automatically to the most deserving person in the room. Influence flows toward the person who manages perception, leverage, and consequence most skillfully. A man may possess wisdom, discipline, and integrity, yet remain invisible if he does not know how to project those qualities into the structures of power around him. Meanwhile, A far less capable rival may ascend rapidly simply because he understands how to shape appearances. Consider how often nice men reveal their entire character too quickly. They explain their intentions openly, reveal their plans prematurely, and show their emotional reactions without restraint. In doing so, they believe they are being transparent and trustworthy. Yet Machiavelli would warn that excessive transparency is rarely a virtue in competitive environments. When everyone understands exactly what you want, they also understand exactly how to control you. Strategic restraint, on the other hand, creates a different kind of presence. A man who reveals his thoughts selectively becomes difficult to predict. His silence forces others to think carefully about how to approach him. His calm refusal to overshare signals emotional discipline, and emotional discipline is one of the most intimidating forms of power a man can possess. Nice men often underestimate the power of mystery because they associate it with dishonesty. They believe sincerity requires complete openness, constant explanation, and endless reassurance. But Machiavelli understood that the world does not operate like a confessional booth. The man who explains everything invites unnecessary scrutiny, unnecessary opposition, and unnecessary interference from people who were never entitled to that information in the first place. Another mistake nice men make is confusing agreement with peace. They nod along to ideas they secretly oppose because they wish to avoid tension. They soften criticism because they fear appearing harsh. They tolerate small injustices because confronting them feels uncomfortable. But every time a man sacrifices truth for the sake of immediate harmony, he weakens his long-term authority. Machiavelli recognized that authority grows from a man's willingness to enforce limits. People may initially resist those limits, but they eventually organize their behavior around them. A man who never enforces boundaries becomes an open territory where anyone can wander without consequence. His kindness gradually becomes a public utility that others consume freely, without ever feeling obligated to reciprocate. In contrast, the man who occasionally demonstrates firmness becomes someone others approach more carefully. They measure their words around him. They calculate their actions more precisely. His presence quietly alters the atmosphere of the room because people understand that his patience has edges. The paradox here is fascinating. The man who is capable of severity often needs to use it very rarely. His reputation does the work for him. The man who is incapable of severity, however, must constantly negotiate for basic respect because no one believes there will be consequences if they ignore him. Machiavelli observed this principle repeatedly in the courts of Renaissance Italy. Princes who tried to please everyone eventually pleased no one. Their kindness encouraged factions to push harder and harder against them. Their attempts to avoid conflict only multiplied the number of conflicts they eventually faced. Meanwhile, rulers who demonstrated controlled firmness early in their reigns often enjoyed long periods of stability afterward. For the modern man, the lesson is not about ruling kingdoms, but about ruling himself. The man who cannot say no becomes surrounded by demands. The man who cannot confront disrespect becomes surrounded by disrespect. And the man who cannot tolerate short-term discomfort becomes trapped in long-term frustration. This is why Machiavellian awareness is so powerful for men who have spent their lives trying to be liked. It forces them to reconsider the difference between kindness and compliance. Kindness is a conscious choice to treat others well. Compliance is the unconscious habit of surrendering your own position to avoid tension. One comes from strength, the other grows from fear. A man who studies power begins to recognize how frequently people test each other without even realizing it. A colleague interrupts him in meetings to see whether he will push back. A friend makes dismissive jokes to gauge how much disrespect will be tolerated. A rival spreads subtle rumors to observe how effectively he will defend his reputation. These small experiments in dominance occur constantly beneath the surface of everyday interactions. Nice men often fail these tests not because they are weak, but because they do not recognize the tests are happening at all. They interpret aggression as misunderstanding, manipulation as coincidence, and disrespect as harmless humor. Their generosity blinds them to the strategic calculations taking place around them. Machiavelli would advise something very simple in these moments: observe before reacting. Pay attention to patterns rather than isolated incidents. When someone repeatedly crosses boundaries, assume intention rather than accident. When someone repeatedly benefits from your patience without reciprocating it, recognize that patience has become their strategy. Once a man begins seeing these dynamics clearly, his posture changes. He speaks more deliberately. He chooses his alliances more carefully. He learns to reward loyalty and quietly distance himself from opportunists. Most importantly, he stops feeling guilty for defending his own interests in a world where everyone else is doing exactly the same thing. This shift is not about becoming cynical, it is about becoming lucid. The Machiavellian advice for nice men is therefore not an invitation to cruelty, but an invitation to awareness. Understand the tools others use, even if you choose not to use them yourself. Study the psychology of influence, even if you remain personally honorable. Recognize how power flows through institutions, relationships, and reputations, so that you are no longer surprised by the outcomes those forces produce. At a certain point, the nice man begins to notice a quiet shift inside himself. It is not anger, and it is not bitterness. It is clarity. The fog that once surrounded human behavior begins to dissolve, and patterns that once seemed mysterious start to look almost predictable. He sees how influence forms, how people test boundaries, and how respect quietly organizes itself around those who understand leverage. This moment of clarity is exactly what Niccolò Machiavelli hoped thoughtful men would reach after studying the lessons inside the prince. His goal was never to turn good men into villains. His goal was to prevent good men from becoming casualties in a world where many people already understand the darker mechanics of ambition. Because the greatest danger to a decent man is not cruelty, it is naivety. Once a man understands this, something remarkable happens. He stops trying to convince everyone of his worth. He stops chasing approval like a currency he desperately needs. Instead, he focuses on strengthening his position, sharpening his perception, and protecting the boundaries that give his life structure. The man who once feared conflict now sees it as information. The man who once feared losing people now realizes that the wrong people leaving is often the beginning of freedom. Machiavellian wisdom ultimately asks a difficult question. Do you want to merely appear good, or do you want to actually achieve something meaningful in the real world? Because those two paths sometimes demand very different strategies. The man who insists on appearing harmless may preserve his reputation for kindness, but he will often surrender his influence to those who understand how power actually moves through human systems. But the man who learns to combine intelligence with integrity becomes something far more formidable. He is capable of kindness without being naive. He is capable of patience without being passive, and he is capable of firmness without losing his sense of principle. That balance is rare, and precisely because it is rare, it commands respect. The world does not need fewer good men. It needs more good men who understand strategy, men who can recognize manipulation without becoming manipulators themselves, men who can navigate ambition without losing their character, men who are kind by choice, not because they are too unaware to defend themselves. That is the real Machiavellian lesson for nice men, not to abandon their values, but to stop walking through life with their eyes closed. And if this message resonated with you, make sure you support the channel by liking the video, sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribing for more powerful philosophical insights like this. Your support helps this channel continue bringing timeless wisdom from thinkers like Machiavelli into the modern world. And if you want to go deeper into these ideas, check the link in the description to support the channel. And join us as we continue exploring the hidden strategies behind power, influence, and the psychology of human behavior.